Yes.
I have a question in terms of the practical terms of how this is applied. So I'm involved with a nonprofit, and if I would like to, initiate a partnership with a university, the university department, I'd like to know how that worked in your examples that you gave.
Okay. Okay, so the question is, how can a community group initiate that kind of a relationship with, or initiate such a research partnership with a university? And I have to say that unfortunately in most universities, I think that that's a fairly, you have to know somebody in order to approach them. Now I understand that the University of Saskatchewan is just now setting up some kind of a community-based research center, although in Saskatoon you're very fortunate to have the Community University Institute for Social Research, QUISAR, here, which allows, they do have an academic director and a community director, and it specifically is to do community-based research. That's fairly unusual. There's only a few centers across Canada set up at universities that are for community-based research, but that would certainly be the place to go, would be to contact the university and ask if they have somebody that does community-based research. In our case,
Could you repeat the name of that department you were talking about?
Community University Institute for Social Research, and one of the co-directors, Louise, is right here. So there, you two just have, Isabel works there. In Northern Ontario, we're building a network. That's part of the application that Lou was mentioning when she introduced me, is we're building a network of people who are working in community-based research across Northern Ontario, so that we can refer people. You know, if someone calls me and they're from Sudbury and they want to do a piece of community-based research, then I'll be able to refer them to someone at Laurentian as opposed to working with them myself from Sault Ste. Marie. Other thoughts? Questions? Yes, Roger?
Yeah, it's a conversation that we've had before, but it might be useful to sort of have with the larger group. I guess the question is, how do you end the relationship? Not that that's necessarily a desirable thing, but sometimes out of circumstance, whether it's the end of funding or a natural conclusion to whatever issue is being explored and addressed, how do you wind it down in such a way that doesn't leave a vacuum or a dependency or ill feelings because of a sense of abandonment, I suppose?
Yeah. And I've heard that many times from First Nation communities. They say, well, somebody's come on, okay, so the question was, how do you wind down, how do you wind down or end the research so that the community doesn't feel abandoned or lost, or, you know, their needs are not overlooked? Again, in these pieces of research, there's been a whole variety of ways. With the farmers, we actually had hired an intern. We hired 2 different interns that worked with them for a year each. As you know, as we, like from the beginning, so in one way, one of the things that you can do is you can set the expectations at the very beginning so that everybody's very clear that this is as much resources as the university is going to be able to allocate. Like we have 2 years of funding, or we have 3 years of funding, or we've got 6 months of funding, and this is as much as we can do within that funding envelope. So I think being clear about the expectations at the beginning is a really important thing. In the case of the farmers that I was going to use as an example, we told them that, initially we told them we'd do 1 year, and then at the end of that year it seemed like we were just kind of getting to a point where we knew that it was kind of an opportunity for breaking through a bit of a barrier when it came to the marketing. So we said, okay, we can accommodate by giving you 1 more year of an intern working with you. And so we did that for one more year, but they were very clear that they knew that there had to be plans for them to take over these various marketing roles at the end of that year. And that was one of the things that we put right in the work plan with the intern, so that as the intern was doing different things, for example, implementing the marketing plan, then he was evaluating, the different types of marketing tools he was using, radio ads or banners or whatever. And he left, he put together a binder of these different, who to contact where, when, what opportunities there were and so on, so that they had a package that they could take away and then they could do it as volunteer board members, because they still don't have the funding right now to hire a full-time staff person. So they took that piece of it away with them. But I think that it's really important that you start with, managing expectations. The third way, of course, is that you don't actually leave. You just keep you just keep working and expanding, and that is often the case. Some of the projects have just expanded and expanded. Like the Coalition for Algoma Passenger Trains, it's now incorporated itself as a not-for-profit, and it's now applying for its own funding and doing its own work. The lead researcher is probably always going to be engaged with them because that's just her passion. So I think it's, those are important things to do. Other questions?
There's no other questions. I have one.
Okay, go for it.
Well, this whole area of interdisciplinary research, I think, cannot be underrated or undervalued. More and more, it appears that researchers are having to be, in addition to good skilled researchers, they need to have a lot of community skills, and they need to listen. But my question is relating more to looking at your part of Canada, roughly what percentage of research is community-based research? What percentage roughly is corporation kind of research? And what percentage is roughly public-funded research?
Okay, so the question is, what percentage of research is publicly funded, privately or corporately funded, and what percentage would be community-based research? Is that right? In my part of Canada. So in my part of Canada, which is Northern Ontario, I don't have the exact percentage figures for you, but I can tell you that community-based research is a pretty small percentage of what's being done. Now, in terms of public funding for it, pretty well all of the research, with one exception, I think all of the research I've done has been publicly funded. We have one project that is what it's doing is looking at ways of rehabilitating the land underneath power lines, so that's looking at saving species at risk and maintaining like marshlands and so on. And that particular piece of research does get some private corporate funding, but all the rest is publicly funded. I think in in the universities in Northern Ontario, there is not a lot of private money as yet going into that research because we don't have a lot of, right now, most of the big corporations in Northern Ontario have pulled out. The only place that I know of that gets any kind of corporate funding for research would be I'm going to call it by the wrong name, but it's the lab at Laurentian University that does research related to mining, and it gets a substantial amount of money from corporate donors. So I can't tell you about larger universities, because that's not my experience. Sorry. Yep, Mike.
Gayle, I'm going to ask a question that is perhaps a bit academic, but we are at the university today. And that is unpacking this concept of community a little bit. It's being presented and in a sense explained through examples here. And there are different kinds of community that you're connecting with as a university-based researcher, with strong community roots as well. And I'm just wondering, you know, what kind of groupings or what kinds of collectivities constitute suitable community partners as far as you're concerned? And another way of saying that, are there any groups or individuals or formal or informal collectivities that you would not probably partner with? And are there any kinds of projects you probably would either ask to see recast or reformulated before you would put your energies towards them, or others that you would just probably shy away from? Maybe because they don't fit your definition of the social economy, but maybe because something else about them doesn't quite fit your concept of what a community development initiative could be or should be.
Okay, so the question is, we want to unpack the concept of community, and are there some organizations, some community groups that would not fit within my definition of communities that I would work with? So I'll address the first thing about the concept of community. Yes, for me, a community may be a geographic community. They may be a community of interest. They may be a community of identity. So there can be a whole wide variety of communities that we're dealing with. So in some cases, we're dealing, as we are in Fort Albany, with a whole First Nation, an entire community that is geographic, but it also is a legal entity, Fort Albany First Nation. With many of the other communities, you know, the farmers are obviously a community of interest, a collection of beef farmers in the Algoma district. And others, like, although I didn't highlight it here, we did some work with Queer Voices of the North Film Festival, which is you know, a community of identity. So those are, you know, we do work with those communities. When we look at the priorities that we set for the community groups that we work with, there's a number of, there's two general areas within the mandate of Nordic and I suppose CSD as well, but the mandates are to work with Indigenous communities as well as to work in regional development. But within that, we've also set some other priorities. So certainly, in terms of priorities, we are interested in looking at social transformation, working with communities who are equality-seeking groups, some people call them, but some people call them vulnerable groups, some people call them marginalized. But that's basically where our priority is. We're not really into helping rich people get richer. So we look at low-income groups, women's groups, you know, any group that has youth, any group that is experiencing disadvantage because of their position within society. So those are the kinds of community groups that we would certainly put priorities around.